we'll do the live thing first. Like, hey everybody, welcome back to the Bigmark podcast. This is me, your host, Bigmark. If it's your first time watching, welcome. If not, welcome back. Like I always say, if you ever wanted to reach out to the podcast, please hit us up on our DMs at the Bigmark Pod or at the Bigmark Podcast on our Twitter or Instagram. Please like and share the podcast. If you have any friends who you think would enjoy the podcast, let them know. If you can rate it, if you can write a review, that'd be even better. If you're watching on YouTube, like the video, subscribe to our channel so you know when all our new videos are coming next. And again, if you ever wanted to donate to the podcast, our Patreon, patreon.com/thebigmarkpod, has a few different tiers there to choose from. Thank you all for your ongoing support. I really appreciate each and every one of you, and thank you for your time tonight. It's a bit of a tougher episode ahead that I've been thinking about only for the past day or so, but long enough that you do some thinking. And unfortunately, I wanted to dedicate this podcast and this show and every episode and send my thoughts and love and prayers and whatever I can possibly do from a distance. And anyway, if energy exists still, if it persists even past death, I'm sending that positive love and energy to a dear friend of the podcast, Sarah Vare, who has sadly passed away. She is a great friend of the podcast. I was lucky and privileged enough to have her as a guest, and again, privileged to know her at all. Went to university together and stayed in touch. Luckily, followed her through her psychedelic journey, and she was a great advocate, working for Behold Retreats and starting her own psychedelic therapy business. Big inspiration to myself, and thinking about potentially pursuing a career in guided meditations or guided therapies, things like that. She will be missed. She'll be sorely missed. But again, and we'll hopefully get into it in today's episode, if it's true what they say, if energy does persist, and if we do potentially ascend to a different plane, or there is a life after death, I hope all the best. And again, thoughts and prayers and love, only love, towards her and her family. Again, obviously, hearing the news was such a shock and terrible. Someone so young passing away, and obviously brought up thoughts of other people that I've known, who have unfortunately left us early. And obviously people experience a lot of death in their life. It's part of life. Carl Jung kind of likened the human experience to much like an arc on a curve. That trajectory is inevitably leading to death. And it is a part of life just as much as living is. And it's tough. I mean, it's when you're experiencing that, or you've lost a loved one, someone close to you, it's really hard to think that way and think, oh yeah, it's just a part of life. And when until you've experienced that mega loss, it's easy to say, hey, yeah, obviously death's part of life. It's how it goes. But it truly is. And if we are inevitably leading to that that end, it doesn't make it any easier. You know, maybe, and a lot of people do have a long arc and a long trajectory, and they live a life full of many experiences and ups and downs and things like that, and they make it to old age and they die in natural causes. But then there's a lot of people whose life is cut short, sadly. You know, one of my good friends from high school, Nico Sienna, he was horribly, horrifically taken early from this earth, from this earthly plane, and that was awful to deal with. He was shot in his home by a neighbor, and just terrible. Just, you don't think you'd ever have to deal with that as a person, let alone like knowing someone who died like that, let alone as a friend. And again, I'm saying this as a person, and I consider myself, you know, privileged enough to live a safe life and not have a lot of friends gruesomely murdered. But you know, you talk to someone, you talk to anyone else in other parts of the world who friends and family members have been killed with gun violence or in war or anything like that, right? Like, you know, there's a quote, I don't know who said it, but they say the worst thing that's ever happened to you is the worst thing that's ever happened to you. And I think that's essentially saying, like, you can't really necessarily compare traumas to people, you know, compare traumas, because your trauma is your trauma and your experience is your experience. But again, when it comes to death and loss, the more and more you experience it, I feel like it's probably easy to lose the weight of it. You know, I remember a good friend of mine, Ryan Kotar. His one of his older brothers passed away really young. I think he was only 19, and we would have been like 15 or 16. Maybe 16, I think. And so heavy, just the sadness and weight and heaviness, the loss and grief, and it's such a major weight. Like you almost become exhausted from carrying it for so long that when you lose others, it's almost like you don't even know what to do anymore. You just are so used to that heaviness following you around. And again, thinking of war times or other places in the world where there's extreme death and times of great loss. You know, even look back a couple of years over COVID, you know, there was a lot of talk about people dying and that threat of death and that looming aspect of, like, you know, mortality, and it, you know, one false move, if you don't wash your hands, all of a sudden you're going to die. Like that heaviness that kind of like followed us around for years. Like, or again, like I said, throughout history, when people have been in situations where they're just surrounded by death, like, I feel like you can't help but feel so numb to it eventually. And it's scary and it's terrible. But again, when you don't experience death very often, or again, like I said, even when it's a loved one and their death is expected, it doesn't make it any easier. And it just becomes, it can just become so heavy. And, you know, again, losing grandparents, losing family members, you know, like all my grandparents passed away. What my dad's father was, he unfortunately passed before I was born. My mom's dad passed when I was in grade 7. My mom's mom died when I was in grade 12. Yeah, grade 12. And then my dad's mom passed when I was in the 3rd year. So I was pretty young. You know, I was like, what's that? Like 22? I was about 22 when my when I lost my last grandparent, my nana. And it just, you kind of get used to just like, I'm sad because I didn't have a lot of older people in my life to lean on, or I felt close to them, because again, just lost them so early in life. And again, losing, it's interesting. It's interesting even losing like friends close, like friends, loved ones, friends, grandparents and parents. And, I mean, honestly, luckily I've had a few friends whose parents have passed, but I didn't know them at the time, of the passing. And obviously my heart goes out to them. And again, losing a loved one, even if it's expected, even if they're sick and they're battling. I've had a few. Actually, that's not true. My good friend Paul Hart, shout out Paul. I mean, I haven't seen you in forever, and I miss you. I love you if you're listening. But yeah, his father passed away while we were still friends. But again, anyone I know out there that's missed a loved one, obviously my parents as well. And of course, what year would that have been when Johnny passed? Oh my gosh. My other grandfather, Andrea's dad, Johnny, he passed away, I want to say right around when I was in university as well. Oh my gosh. Again, just losing those people who are so close, or they that older generation where they have so much wisdom and so many things to impart. I felt like I was so immature when they all passed. I didn't know what to ask them, even if I could, in some circumstances, they wouldn't have necessarily been able to answer. But again, losing that wisdom, and I still am a little bit like, I don't really know how to act around a lot of people who are elderly, because again, I don't have as much experience being around them, and it's a guilt and a burden. But again, when you lose someone that's close to you, you lose all those hopes and thing, like ideas and aspirations and questions you wanted to ask, or recipes you wanted to get from them, or stories you wanted to hear. They all just are gone. And the experiences that you might have, right? Like anything, right? It doesn't matter. It always makes me think of this great quote by Lemony Snicket. Well, by Daniel Handler, who wrote Lemony Snicket, who wrote under the pseudonym Lemony Snicket. It's a curious thing, the death of a loved one. We all know that our time in this world is limited, and that eventually all of us will end up underneath some sheet, never to wake up. And yet it is always a surprise when it happens to someone we know. It's like walking up the stairs to your bedroom in the dark and thinking there's one more stair than there is. Your foot falls down through the air, and there's a sickly moment of dark surprise as you try and readjust the way you thought of things. And I always thought that made so much sense. It's hard, right? It's hard losing anyone, even losing a friend that didn't pass away. You just, lost touch, fell out of contact, right? Like the grief that can be associated with that too is just as heavy, right? Like that whole idea of, carrying around this weight, this heaviness, this burden. And you miss people, right? Like even breakups, it's a death. It's this feeling of loss and guilt and sadness and heaviness, and you want to change things. You wish you could go back in time. You want to do a million different things. You want to tear yourself apart just to try and put things back together. And again, how can we reconcile that thought of death is a part of life? And when there's so many other places in life, we're starting to enter the fall here in Southern Ontario, and leaves are falling off the trees. Plants are dying. All the flowers and things, as winter starts to come. Winter brings this idea of death and barren and stripping life off the trees and the air and the environment, whatever you want to say. Winter brings this idea of death, but then spring is renewed. So there's the thought, right? Is that, yes, there's a death. Yes, there's many deaths. There's millions of deaths. But there's also 1,000,001 ways we're reborn, right? The sun goes down. There was for many millennia, or whatever you want to say, for thousands of years, humans worshiped the sun. And when it went away for those 3 days during the solstice, winter solstice, when the sun doesn't come back over the horizon in certain parts of the world for a couple days, people thought the fucking world was going to end. They didn't know that the sun was going to come back. Even sometimes at night, I'm sure they were fucking worried that who knows if the sun's going to come up. But we know day in, day out, that sun's come back up. And everywhere else, yes, obviously when we lose a loved one, they don't come back in 3 days. It's not Jesus, even though Jesus was an allegory for that whole winter solstice thing. The sun, Jesus, goes away for 3 days, comes back. Anyway, but maybe that on the longer scale, the time scale that is eternity, there is an ebb and flow of death and rebirth. In the psychedelic experience, if you've gotten to that point in your journey and you've experienced an ego death, stripping of your ego, it's again a death, the feeling of losing that part of your being, whether that's your some people mistake it as your conscience, but this ego that bounds you to this kind of 3D reality. Once that's gone and you're kind of at least seeing past the veil a little bit, you're kind of understanding, even just a glimpse, at least you're seeing it, what kind of potentially lies beyond this day-to-day reality that we experience, right? What I see in front of my face right now. Life, experience, 3D reality, right? Again, 13 known dimensions right now. We live in 3D reality, fourth dimension being time. If there's all these other dimensions that coexist with us right now, and we do some type of psychedelic, and that allows us to maybe tap into some of those other dimensions, or in the case of DMT, potentially converse with some of these beings that are maybe from another realm. When we have those experiences and have that ego death, it is like experiencing a small death in some ways. They call it ego death for that reason. You're kind of experiencing, some people, and myself included, in a very, very, very light extent, but I know a lot of psychedelic stories come about people doing the substance and worrying that they've taken too much of it, and then ascending into a whole new realm, and then coming back. And of course, I can't talking about this right now, I can't stress enough responsible use. Even still, it's hard to advocate for any substances right now. But again, when you experience that small ego death, there's this overwhelming lesson that's learned that potentially there is something past this reality that we experience. Who knows? Maybe truly the lights go out. Maybe when we die, all of a sudden, boom, it's fucking black and it's done. And you don't exist anymore. There's no thoughts, there's no soul, there's no nothing. There's nothing that can exist. Again, we're just, our human experience is monistic. It's one thing. Our brain and our body are one. There is no soul necessarily. All of our thoughts and feelings are just chemical, or results of chemical reactions that are happening in our brain. Randomly, completely up to nature, no reason. As soon as our heart stops beating or our brain ceases to function, whatever you want to call true death, it's over. It lights out. This is where it also comes in the thought, like, I think about anyway. Oh my God, it's a fucking weird way to say that. Anyway, this reminds me of a thought, is that there are a lot of people who have said that they've had, near after death experiences, not even near death experiences, after death experiences, come back and told us, hey, I died, come back. Yes, some people, their heart stops for minutes, stuff happens in the emergency room, things happen and you medically die. But if you come back, I don't think you've truly experienced death. Death to me is you've gone. You've not only ceased to, your like biological functions are done, but you're gone. You can't come back to this reality for whatever reason. It's a one-way ticket. I don't know why. Yes, maybe some people claim that they have, but I still think that that's some other, at least veiled experience into what real death is. So again, once we go past this thing, if there is that, again, like I said, if the lights go out, whatever, there's no fucking more conversation about that, right? But if there is something else that persists, all these many religions, all these scholars, all these different people thinking about what happens after death, do we reincarnate? Do we just, as soon as the lights come out, they come back on and you're being born in the fucking hospital or wherever? Do you ascend to another plane, another reality? Do you get to go roam around the cosmos and go see whatever and experience the universe as a higher being and manipulate time? Because again, you're above the fourth dimension, so now you see time even as a physical dimension potentially. Who knows? Are you a fucking ghost, right? Like Paranormal Activity, man. Who knows what that shit is? If you get stuck here somehow, you get stuck in this reality, you have to fucking, again, a lot of ghost stories are like, oh, someone have unfinished business, and then, well, what happens when you finish the business? Blah blah blah. Who knows if those dimensions somehow do interact? Again, if you ascend to another dimension, does time become this whole nebulous thing where all time is kind of like, there is like an idea in physics right now, not even just like woo woo world, like in real life, that all time is essentially kind of happening at once. We experience it in a linear fashion, but like the idea of time is that it's all this one big fucking flat circle. Who knows? It's hard to even imagine. Like, this is the craziest thing, right? Again, it's hard for a two-dimensional being to imagine a third dimension, right? If they can only exist in two dimensions, how can they even fathom that there's another one? It's better left to the suits in Washington. That's what I say. But again, death is a fear, right? It's this people are scared of dying. People are, I'm definitely afraid of getting hurt. I don't want to injure myself and be in pain and have to fucking be hurt and disfigured and all fucked up. So I consider that I live a pretty cautious life. I don't jump off a lot of things. I don't drive fast cars, things like that. Maybe again, I've been a little fast and loose with the old psychedelics, but again, it's always been in a concerted and safe and responsible way. But I don't consider myself afraid of dying. I'm not afraid of what potentially comes next. I'm afraid of hurting, and I don't want any of my loved ones to experience those feelings of loss and grief. So of course I don't want to die. But again, there doesn't exist that feeling of what happens after. In some ways, I feel like, yeah, you get released, you get loosed from this mortal coil, and you move on to a whole new experience. Jung said, shrinking away from death is something unhealthy and abnormal, which robs the second half of life of its purpose. And again, like I said at the beginning of the podcast, Carl Jung really believed life is this whole trajectory from birth to death. Living is, a major part of that, but life is the beginning and the end. And, it's this, we again perceive time in this linear fashion. And we kind of think that death is this end point where things are cease to exist. And it's true in some ways, right? Like, even look at the Mayan calendar. People are like, oh, the world's going to end in 2012. Maybe it's not that the world is going to end, but the world as we know it might have ended, might have changed. Maybe that was what they were, what the Mayans were trying to get at, is that there was going to be a major change in how things were. And yes, the end of the world exists in that idea, and the end of life exists in death. But maybe it's just the end of life as we know it, is the end of existence as we know it, or that person, It's like, it's this, I was watching Lord of the Rings. Shout out. And it reminded me of a quote. There's a scene where Pippin and Gandalf are in Minas Tirith, and the walls are crumbling all around them. And Pippin's afraid, and he says to Gandalf, "I didn't think it would end this way." And Gandalf says, "End? No. The journey doesn't end here. Death is just another path, one that we must all take. The gray rain curtain of this world rolls back, and all turns to silver glass. And then you see it." Pippin says, "What, Gandalf? See what?" And Gandalf says, "White shores, and beyond a far green country, under a swift sunrise." Pippin says, "Well, that isn't so bad." Gandalf says, No, it isn't." Again, who knows what happens after death? Who knows what exists out there? Again, maybe we do get another chance. If we do, and we are on our second or third or 12 millionth chance or whatever of reincarnation, I'm happy that we all found ourselves here. Again, this podcast, this whole episode of everything dedicated to Sarah and Nico and my grandparents and everyone I've lost throughout my life. And I love you and I miss you. And I hope if there is something going on out there and there's other dimensions and you can come and check in on this one, if all the religions or whatever, at least Catholicism is true and your loved ones are up there watching out for you, shout out. Hope I'm making you proud somehow. At least not letting you down. Anyway, I love you all. Thank you all for listening. Again, reach out. Hit us up on our DMs. Patreon. If you're watching on YouTube, you know what to do. I love you all. Talk to you soon. Peace. Peace.